Hello. Today we're going to talk about Elizabethan England. We'll do some historical background, then we'll get into the ideas of Elizabethan culture, especially as they impacted what Shakespeare was trying to write and talk about in his plays, who his audience was, and some of the other ideas that Shakespeare pursued. So let's first talk a little bit about England as it relates to the Renaissance. In our previous lecture, we talked about the Italian Renaissance, which, as you recall, starts here in Italy. And very quickly, because of technology and transportation, and because a lot of the ideas of the Renaissance are pretty amazing, that Renaissance spreads all throughout Europe. Spain, France, the Low Countries, Germany, all over the place, very quickly. England is a little bit late to the party. Geographically, here's why. Let's take a look at the rest of Europe, and then up there in the left-hand corner is England. It is isolated by the English Channel, which is not impossible to sail over, obviously, but it's sort of an inconvenience. And generally speaking, it is sort of out of the way, geographically and politically. During the 1400s, England is kind of a political mess. It doesn't have any military prominence. It doesn't have any intellectual prominence. Really, nobody cares about it. So for most of the 1400s and into the 1500s, England is pretty much this isolated backwater nation of sheep herders. The only real economic significance England has is wool, is the wool business, really. And it is sort of the place where Europe goes for wool trading, but there's not a lot else going on. So we're mired in this place where England has the possibility maybe to move forward, but for a variety of reasons, they simply don't. This starts to change once we get the Tudor line of kings, specifically Henry VII and Henry VIII. These two guys, throughout the course of the 1500s, move England into line with the Renaissance in a couple of key different ways. Henry VII, among other things, and he strengthens the nobility and does a handful of other things, but he accepts and promotes university education in the model of Renaissance Italy. So, universities had existed in England for a long time. Oxford, Cambridge had been around for a while, but both in terms of cultural influence and in terms of actual money invested, Henry VII really looks at what the Renaissance universities are doing in Italy and says, we need to replicate that here. And one of the results of that is, hey, English people, don't go off to, rich English people don't need to go off to Italy or to the continent generally to go to university. They can stay here and become that model of a Renaissance man. And this embrace of Renaissance education, liberal arts approach, and also to this broad-based humanist secular approach to education and the world is a really big deal. And you could do it now here in England. The other guy, obviously, we want to talk about, as we mentioned, is Henry VIII. If you know your Henry VIII history, you've heard all this story before, but very briefly, Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon. She's Spanish, she's Catholic, and the two of them cannot have a kid. They keep trying, and it doesn't work. And Henry needs male heirs, like any king does, to continue his line. So Henry's kind of fed up with this lack of children, and he's also sleeping with Anne Boleyn at the time, who is younger and cuter. And, what he would really like to do is ditch Catherine and marry Anne. He thinks maybe Anne can give him kids, possibly. So at this time, Henry VIII is, as is the rest of England, a good Catholic. You want to get a divorce, you got to ask the Pope. So, multiple times Henry says, hey, Pope, hey, Catholic Church, will you please let me divorce my wife? And the answer is, no, you can't do it. And what happens from this interpersonal dispute where one guy wants to basically ditch one wife and find another wife, seems like a kind of small thing, right? We have a massive and sort of forward-moving cultural change that will influence who England is and what their culture is all about for the rest of their country's history. Here's what I mean by that. Henry says, I'm fed up with this business. All right, Catholics, you're dumb. Instead of the Pope being the head of the church, I should be the head of the church. Therefore, I can grant myself a divorce. And again, it's for simple marriage-based lineage practical reasons, and because he also wanted to sleep with Anne Boleyn legitimately as a husband and wife. What comes from this guy and his desires is that he takes up with the Protestant church. Martin Luther had already started Protestantism in Germany in the 1400s, and Protestantism is a movement and says, hey, look, we don't need the Catholic Church. We don't need all this Pope business to tell us what to do and how to do things. We can worship God in our own way. Henry honestly doesn't care that much about how you worship God. He just doesn't want to be told what to do by the Pope. And so not only does he say, all right, I'm going to be Protestant, and England is going to be Protestant. That's a huge shift. But he says, I'm going to create the Church of England. I'm not just going to be a Protestant. I'm going to create a whole brand new church the top of which will be me. And there will be bishops and other important religious figures, but they'll have to report to me. This means the monarch of England is also the head of the Church of England. This means, from a practical standpoint, that Henry can marry who he wants to or chop off the head of who he wants to, and he does have a really bad record with wives moving forward. But more importantly, it means that England is now a politically and religiously independent nation. It doesn't have to curry favor with Italy, with the Pope, with the Catholic Church, with many of the other Catholic nations in Europe, but in fact, it can do its own thing. And if there's one sort of through line or story through this whole Elizabethan England lecture, it is the development of Englishness, of English independence, and the sort of England coming into its own as a country. And that's basically what these two gentlemen end up doing, is through the different things they do, England becomes smarter, better educated, embraces the Renaissance, wealthier. Oh, because as a side note, when Henry VIII kicks the Catholic Church out of England, the Catholic Church is one of the primary landholders. Every single Catholic church holds some amount of land around it, right? In the old model of serfdom, where you've got people who are farming the land and paying rent to the church. That is a fantastic amount of income. That is right now, before Henry VIII kicks him out, all that money's going back to the Pope, or much of it is. Now, it's all coming straight to him. So it makes England as a nation much more wealthy and politically independent. So these two guys take us down the road from England being this irrelevant sheep-herding backwater nation to England starting to become kind of a big deal. That transition continues on with this fine lady, arguably the most useful tutor, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth is Henry VIII's daughter, and she reigns from 1558 to 1603. This will be a recurring theme throughout history. Anytime you see a monarch who reigns for a long period of time, that typically means a period of stability and growth within that country. And that is certainly the case here. Among Elizabeth's claims to fame, she comes in and succeeds Catholic Queen Bloody Mary. And without getting into it too much, after Henry VIII dies, there are some transitional things that go on, and Mary, who is Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, Mary takes over for a little while, changes the whole country back to Catholicism. And the reason she's called Bloody Mary is because if you were a Protestant, and right when Mary comes along and changes things back to Catholicism, if you were a Protestant, you're going to be in big trouble, as in probably executed, tortured, burned at the stake, etc. So there is a sort of uprising. Henry VIII's daughter Elizabeth is put on the throne. Bloody Mary, she's out. Goodbye. And we are back to Protestantism. That's, again, a big step forward because England continues to establish and sort of protect its political and religious independence. Elizabeth is also, as a monarch, relatively speaking, socially and politically liberal. She allows her people to kind of do what they want to. She allows art to flourish in a humanistic, non-religious kind of way, which is a really big deal. Now, she doesn't just let anything fly. There's a lot of censorship and a lot of political intrigue and backstabbing and executions during her time, but relatively speaking, she does let England kind of develop its own personality and characteristics outside of heavy government censorship. She's a little liberal. She also, well, she doesn't do it, but in 1588, Spain, who's now really obviously annoyed, Spain is a Catholic country, Spain's annoyed that Catherine of Aragon got booted out and that the Catholic Church got booted out. So Spain, which is at the time the most powerful military in the world, puts together an enormous armada of Spanish ships and heads off to invade the mainland of England. And without going into too much detail, the underdog, scrappy, small English ships kicked the Spanish Armada's ass. And this is a huge shift in where England might have gone, because it's totally plausible that the Armada would have won, that there would have been a land invasion, Elizabeth I would have been executed, and we would have had a Catholic government in England. basically a puppet state of Spain. That's possible that could have happened, but it doesn't. And one of the things this really does is develops England as a world power. Hey, we beat Spain. And there's a real shifting in power from Spain to England and France as well. We'll talk about them later. But it's a huge transition, and it means that being English, again, is in another way pretty amazing and incredible. And over the course of Elizabeth's reign, we further developed this notion, started by Henry VII and Henry VIII, that being English is awesome and is a pretty impressive thing. England becomes a world power, it becomes politically independent, and then it has time to sort of sit back and develop the things it means to be English. And we'll talk about those in segment 2.